During the colonial period, education had its primary roots in English culture. During this time, real work was considered to be farming and was viewed as the most important. This meant that schools were used for children to get a basic knowledge and understanding so they were able to work on their family farm, and of course be able to read their Bibles. Settlers initially tried to develop a system that was similar to the system that the British used. This type of two-track system resulted in students coming from a lower class to receive a basic elementary education of reading, writing, practical skills, and religious instruction. The students came from a higher class would have the opportunities to receive a higher education in Latin grammar schools, to receive a college prep education. The primary objective of the elementary schools was to allow the children to learn to read and write so that they would be able to read their Bible and receive salvation. The curriculum during this era stressed religious views and had very religious objectives. The curriculum was based on the religious motives that drove the Puritans to endure the hard times of settling in the new land. The status of the teachers was relatively low because their job needed minimal requirements and they received very little pay. The respect increased with the increase of grade level because the amount of education needed for their positions increased. This is common in today's society as well. The teachers in the elementary schools were given the least respect because the only requirement was that they went to an elementary school themselves. Teachers were referred to as special but shadowed because they were educated but had many extra duties that placed them at the bottom of the clergy. Some of these extra tasks included ringing church bells, sweeping up after church, teaching Bible lessons, and occasionally being a substitute pastor. The New England colonies believed that the church, state, and schools should not be separated and should go hand in hand with one another. In result of this thinking, town schools were created throughout these colonies to teach children basic knowledge in reading and writing so that they would be able to read Scripture. The Puritans in these colonies believed that people and children were sinful and must be corrected. This represents their idea of premature growth, where teachers must correct the student constantly to try to curb their natural instincts to act more like an adult. This led these schools to be full of strict discipline and severe punishments. The middle colonies were more diverse in their establishments based on their religious beliefs. The wealthy plantation owners of the Protestant southern colonies believed the purpose of education should be to promote religion and prepare children for colleges or universities in Europe. The small farmers of these colonies received no formal schooling, and children of African American slaves only received training in how to serve their masters. There was not a one-school-fits-all for these colonies. There were three main types of schools that were common in these colonies, and only one type was offered to girls. The dame schools were often the only option of schools for young girls. These schools were run by widows or housewives in their homes and were supported by low fees from the parents. These classes were usually held in their kitchens, and children only learned the bare essentials of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Girls also would receive additional instruction in sewing and basic homemaking skills. The reading and writing schools were an educational school for boys that would go beyond what their parents could teach them at home or what they would be able to learn in the dame schools. The reading lessons were based on the Bible and the New England Primer. The primer was first printed in 1690, and children would receive religious warnings about how to behave in their lives. The Latin grammar schools were a higher quality school system than the previous two. The Boston Latin School was founded in 1635 to provide a pre-college education for the new country's future leaders. These type of schools would be comparable to today's secondary schools. Boys would register into this school when they were around 7 or 8 years old, and these schools were in place to prepare students to eventually attend Harvard College, which was established in 1636. After Harvard, they were expected to begin in leadership roles into their churches. Latin and Greek were the main studies in these schools, and the curriculum was rigorous. The students would attend school for 7 years, 6 days a week, for 5 hours in the morning, and then 3 hours in the afternoon. The students were expected to sit all day and take notes, and class discussion was not allowed. Hitting was common in these schools, especially if a student's answer was not satisfactory to the teacher. Schools for African Americans and Native Americans were started much later in New York City in 1704. The Massachusetts Act of 1642 is viewed to be the first school law in the colonies. This meant that every child in the colonies had to be educated. This is the type of law that we are familiar with in today's society. These leaders believed that more organized schools would only strengthen and preserve Puritan religious beliefs. This act did not fully mandate education like it is today, but it established an importance of education. A reform of the law 8 years later, in 1648, reminded town leaders the importance of education and why it needed to be required. This mandated the establishment and support of schools. All in all, schools during the colonial period focused heavily on religion and wanted to prepare these students to be equipped enough to study their scriptures. At the beginning of the colonies, education was not a heavy importance and was very dependent on family choices. As time went on, more school options became available and eventually mandated, which is something that aligns more with today's society.